I should warn you that both of us agreed that probably we're taking more like 15 minutes each than 10. And I'm not here to summarize my book, which is an ambitious book that tries to bring theology and economics into conversation with each other. What I want to just talk about is answer the question, is capitalism good for us? So that's how I ordered my remarks. And what I want to say is I don't know how to answer that question. It depends a whole lot on what do you mean by capitalism. So, meaning one, what you could mean if you ask that question is it good to have a system that prioritizes economic productivity, treats the pursuit of economic progress as an end or a good in itself, encourages firms and individuals to pursue as much profit or income as they can get, in such a way that is as unfettered as possible by other aspects of our society like the culture or like politics? And if that's the way you want to phrase capitalism, my answer when I join my colleague on this one, I think, is hell no. That's a bad system. Modernity has, from the time of Thomas Hobbes, redefined the good life away from an idea that the good life is some pursuit of perfection or fullness in human nature, towards an idea of progress as a pursuit of having more, and especially having more and more. The ancients knew this mistaken approach to pursuing happiness as the vice of pleonexia. I want a 2,000 square foot house. I get my 2,000 square foot house. That's great. Gosh, I really wish I had 3. It's the idea that there's just one more thing, one more thing. It's the spirit that says I always, always want a 10% raise. Capitalism is built on that vice. I would commend to you Albert O. Hirschman's book, The Passions and the Interests, for an excellent account of how a culture built on Christian, Judeo-Christian culture that fully understood pleonexia to be a vice, how it turned that into maybe not quite a virtue, but they tamed it. The development into modernity was to tame the idea of pleonexia into the quasi-virtue of self-interest. And they threw in, and this would be my discipline that did this especially, threw in a story that said, markets are great. They take all that self-interest and they channel it into a way such that if I'm pursuing profit, I will have to bake better bread for you all, and that there will be a social benefit that results. And I'm going to come back and critique that idea a little bit. I want to observe that pleonexia, this pursuit of more, and specifically in our economy, the idea that more wealth is always better and economic growth is always to be desired, takes a variety of forms. I want to distinguish between the pleonexia of the people I'm going to call the wolves, and I think I'm cribbing for Machiavelli here. The pleonexia of the wolf, they don't want money just because they want to have the penthouse or the golden toilet, a la our president. It's the pursuit of wealth because that's the means to power. Say hello, Michael Bloomberg. And that is one wolfish form of pleonexia. The other one is just, and Adam Smith was all over this, to pursue wealth because of the glamour that the society gives us. We just have the glamour around rich people. We can't help but think that they're awesome, and people pursue wealth in order to be those glamorous people. And then there's the pleonexia of the people I want to call the sheep, the ones who aren't necessarily out there to exploit their neighbors. But capitalism has bred a culture that invites us all to be pleonexic. The pleonexia of the sheep is the one where, as I said, we are all utterly convinced that we would just like one more 10% raise. And we're all, I don't know hardly anybody who's not guilty of that. You live in a culture that has assiduously cultivated that sense in you. And by the way, as capitalism evolved, one of the big problems that the early capitalists faced was trying to convince workers that they wanted to work harder for higher incomes so they could get more, because the early laborers would go in and work a couple days and say, got my 3 square meals covered, time to go party. So they had to convert the workforce towards this idea that more is better. Obviously, they do that through advertising and just a lot of social enculturation around this. A variant of that I think is getting increasingly important, and our colleague Mark Schiffman has written on this, is the idea that you want to pursue more wealth with an endless kind of a boundary because you just can't ever be safe enough. So you need to pile up money into your savings and retirement account because who knows what's going to happen. However it goes, the pleonexia of the sheep leaves you incredibly vulnerable to the pleonexia of the wolves, because you will always be willing to do what they say that you need to do in order to get that next 10% raise or whatever. So it's kind of a mutually reinforcing system. Once we have a culture that has embraced the idea that pleonexia is at least okay, if not actually good, and is certainly just is how humans are, it's a recipe for a lot of bad things. Almost all of the problems that our culture faces can be traced back to this. If economic growth is always a good thing, we're going to run through whatever boundaries are set by the environment. You would expect a lot of environmental degradation in such a world. You would expect to see a lot of injustice. The kinds of concerns that Dr. McCarraher is rightly worried about, where firms are trying desperately to hire workers for as cheaply as they can in order to extract as much labor from them as they can, comes out of this pursuit, this endless, boundless pursuit for more profits. I can tell a story in my book about how this unbounded pleonexic desire breeds financial instability and our tendency towards crises. And if that weren't all bad enough, the kicker is that all of this pleonexic pursuit doesn't serve anybody. It doesn't actually generate actual happiness. I just point to our sense of bleakness, alienation, the lack of a sense of meaningful purpose, the stress. Everybody's all stressed out, we're all anxious. This is not a good way to live a human life. So, okay, so down with that. Capitalism really bad. The second meaning, though, you could ask about when you ask about capitalism is, as an economic way of organizing things, is it good to have private property rights? And is it good for people to coordinate their economic activities through markets? And when you construe the question that way, you're thinking about it in opposition to an idea that says we should do our economic system, have it around some kind of top-down planning, and I don't think many people advocate that anymore, or maybe through some kind of widespread socialization of the means of production. And in that context, I want to give a qualified yes. I think we do want a market system, though not an unbridled one. So I just follow the Catholic Church's teachings on this. You want a market that has competence in its own sphere, but is bounded by cultural and political norms and controls, so that it's all ordered to the common good, ideally. Okay. Now, this yes that I give, I want to apply to the two different kinds of worlds we could imagine. First, we can think about the world we have, our pleonexic world. I still kind of want to have markets in this world, even though rapacious capitalism does a lot of bad things. And the reason for that is because I take seriously the problem of the wolves. This is the instinct of people on the right. It's real easy to see that greed and rapaciousness through markets can lead to lots of bad things. But rapacious people don't always work through markets. They sometimes work through governments or through other forms of power. And part of the classic idea about markets is to concede that people are always greedy, they always want more, and to ask, how do we tame that most effectively? And the argument for markets in that context has some purchase. The classic story about markets channeling that greed towards generally productive uses is worth taking on board. And being aware of the way that people with those same unbounded desires, if you put them into places where they have political power or regulatory power, are as often likely to use that for bad ends as for goods. And I could elaborate on that, but I won't. Now, I myself, on this question, am agnostic about how far we should go with the markets versus how far we should go with the state power. Once you notice that wolves are around us all over, you have complicated, intricate debates about how best to balance state and market and these other forces to try to get the best results, given the unbounded pleonexia. There's a wonderful book that I would like to recommend by Asamoah and Robinson called Why Nations Fail, that traces out the various mixes of politics, centralization of political power, centralization of economic powers, to identify the places where it can go well, which turns out, by the way, to be rare. It's fragile to have it work at all well. And then the many ways it can go wrong. Okay, the irony of our present day moment where we have this left-right polarization where it's either all markets, get the state off my back, or let's really, really, really tax the rich and expand the role for state and squeeze the market. It's not addressing the central concern that I get from Asamoah and Robinson, which is how do these two things interplay? So if I look at our modern world today, what horrifies me is not that there's some very, very rich people and not that there's some excessively concentrated state power. It's that they go together. It's crony capitalism and the way that politics is facilitating bad behavior in the markets and the way the concentration of wealth is giving people power in the political arena and the way that goes together. I think it's worthy to note that people on the left have called out this as a problem, as have people on the right. Luigi Zingales will tell you just as vociferously as Dean Baker that crony capitalism is a real and present danger. And I think that's why we live in a political landscape where Trump and Sanders have so much purchase. I would add, just if I might throw in, I'm also worried about the concentration of power that's emerging in Silicon Valley. I think we should be worried about it. Okay. But the other reason to affirm markets is to say if we could get past the pleonexic worldview and think about how economic life that's actually ordered to human flourishing, markets actually do have a role to play there. And I think I'm probably going too long. Can I, 5 more minutes? Professors always like to talk, that's our problem. That you want to articulate the good that markets can do in a way that's not subject to the pleonexic vice. And here I think actually we have at least some resonance. Markets are good because they respect our finitude and our interdependence. So this is a theological argument for markets. My calling in life is not to be a butcher and a baker and a doctor and a pianist, right? I'm a finite person and I realize my own excellence and perfection and my finitude by specializing in one sort of thing. And here I mean a good benign form of specialization. I'm a professor, that's my specialization, and not the kind of specialization you might get in Adam Smith's pin factory where one guy's just straightening out a pin, okay? We want that for lots of reasons. The church fathers would say part of this advantage of having the specialization, and the specialization would then require that we trade with one another. If I'm the professor and you're the baker, we need to be able to make an exchange, is it just builds into human society a sense of our interdependence. So a lot of the early church fathers saw all this as providential. And once we have done the specializing, markets help facilitate those exchanges, okay? So the way to think about this is to imagine if you were not specialized and you had to provide from yourself, all by yourself, right? Think about how long you would have to work in order to make your own shirt and in order to raise up your own food and to build your own house without the assistance from other people who have specialized in their own tasks. And you should quickly realize you would be desperately poor. That is the definition of desperate poverty. Right? So this specialization lifts us all up together in a way that's interdependent and respectful of each other. Okay. I'll abbreviate this. Private property also gives us scope to exercise stewardship over the sphere of God's creation over which we have domain. And if I understand that as ordered to the common good, that means it's always in service of other people. I sometimes like to tell my students we shouldn't think so much in terms of property rights as we should think in terms of private property responsibilities or obligations. And the church's teachings on private property pick up this, that private property gives us a sphere of competence and a sphere of agency that's important as long as it's ordered to the common good. And again, I'm talking about the ideal picture here. Okay. On this vision of the humane economy, the way it would go is this. We would know that economic wealth is meant to serve our higher flourishing and fulfillment. So say I decide to pick up a vocation as a carpenter, as one of our students has done, in fact. I would exercise my own God-given talents by learning the craft of carpentry and doing it well. The other good that I would be pursuing would be to provide my neighbors with well-crafted cabinets, chairs, and stools, and tables. And I would also, through my labors, make a living. So I would be trading my cabinets in exchange for the bread and meat on my table. In such a world, markets have a role to play. If all of a sudden there's a big hurricane in Florida and the price of wood goes up because wood is urgently needed down in Florida, that high price is a signal to me that maybe I need to dial back on my wood cabinets for a season, maybe focus on repair or work with some other material because the wood is needed elsewhere. It's the markets that allow us to send stuff to where it's most urgently needed. So you want to have that in the mix, and I could talk about the good aspects, and believe it or not there are, of banks and finances and all the rest. Of course, the problem is we do not live in this world, and there is this to me is the place where my argument needs the most pushback. Once you allow markets to coordinate these exchanges, markets come with the language of money, and money comes with the sense that more is better. And so there's a suspicion that money invites pleonexia, positively encourages it. So my own take on all of this is we can argue all we want about how we should have the mix of institutions to try to tame the wolves, and those are important debates. But my contribution to the debate is to insist that we also need to talk about the vice of pleonexia, reinstitute it as a vice, and start to get more articulate about what a good and humane economic order would look like. Thank you.
So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. What's that? Yeah. I'll get right to the point. No, capitalism is not good for us, period. But I have to concede something at the outset. If you think that the purpose of an economy is making as many goods and services as cheaply as possible, then capitalism is the system for you. There's simply no doubt that in sheer quantitative terms, capitalism has been the most productive economy in history. If churning out lots of stuff is your criterion for what a functioning economy should be. Defined as the proliferation of commodified goods and services, measured in contemporary terms, in terms of the gross domestic product, the rising material prosperity of the last 2.5 centuries is attributable in no small measure to the spirit and ingenuity of capitalist enterprise. Whatever equity and justice, however, there has been is most certainly not attributable to it, but more on all that later. In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx himself gave us one of the most exuberant celebrations of capitalism in all of modern literature. Yet while I think Marx understood a great deal about how capitalism works and why it's flawed, I don't believe that sheer productivity is the fundamental criterion for an economy. In fact, I think that on this, as on other points, Marx actually shared quite a bit with his capitalist antagonists. Better, I think, is the standard upheld by John Ruskin, a 19th century English writer who may not be known to you, but with whom anyone who's ever taken a course with me is certainly acquainted. Writing at the same time that Charles Dickens was portraying the misery and squalor of industrial capitalism, Ruskin proposed a definition of wealth as something other than the gross domestic product. Wealth, Ruskin wrote, is, quote, the possession of the valuable by the valiant. To Ruskin, good and evil were not externalities, as they are in orthodox economics, a science which, by the way, he boldly likened to alchemy, astrology, and witchcraft. Because the standard economic view of humanity is indifferent to the soul, we should, Ruskin advised, remain indifferent to its conclusions, as, quote, we should be in a science of gymnastics which assumed that men had no skeletons. What he called the real science of political economy, Ruskin continued, instructs us to, quote, desire and labor for things that lead to life, genuine wealth, and to shun, quote, the things that lead to destruction, what he dubbed ilth. Capitalism is fundamentally flawed, I think, because it produces a lot of ilth. It churns out much that is worthless and even positively inimical to human flourishing, and in the process makes us rather less than valiant. At the same time that it ravages our souls, capitalism encourages us to evaluate each other and everything else in the world in terms of pecuniary value. As I contend in my book, it has replaced a sacramental way of understanding the world, in which matter can suggest and convey God's grace and love, with a perversely sacramental way of looking at the world, in which money becomes the effective metaphysic and ontology of business civilization. And it does this, I maintain, as the necessary result of its own internal logic. It can't be reformed or made moral. It has to be dismantled and replaced. Thus, I want to gesture towards some form of socialism as a post-capitalist economy that will enable us to generate wealth, genuine wealth, and valiant people. Now, because of time constraints, I'm going to be saying more about the flaws than about the alternative, but I can always flesh that out in Q&A. Now, while the fundamental problem with capitalism is its moral and even ontological perversity, I don't think it's useful to simply moralize about it. It's common to think that capitalism is about greed, selfishness, consumerism, etc., ad nauseum. This is true as far as it goes, but I'm not sure it goes very far, or if it goes in quite the right direction. Jesus warned about serving mammon well before the appearance of capitalism. And greed or avarice bedeviled us well before the advent of market society. And I agree with Dr. Hirschfeld that, as a believer in original sin, greed is going to be with us until the eschaton. That's why socialism is not, for me, any sort of paradise or utopia. As for consumerism, I'm tired of hearing about it. I can't emphasize enough that consumerism, arguably the modern form of pleonexia, is a structural imperative of capitalism. You need people to buy more and more stuff in order to accumulate capital, which is in the end the goal of capitalism. That's why they call it capitalism. That's why educating and transforming desire is necessary but not sufficient. You have to reorder the institutional logic and arrangements that inexorably distort desire. That is why talking about consumerism all the time is a way of not talking about capitalism. It's crucial to define capitalism first in terms of what it isn't. For one thing, it's not just the market. Societies had markets well before capitalism, and as I'll explain in a moment, markets perform a specific function in capitalism that they don't perform in other economic systems. Moreover, the degree and nature of the freedom in the free market is precisely one of the points at issue. Similarly, capitalism is not just about the search for profit. Merchants and moneylenders took profits in ancient Rome, medieval Bruges, and Renaissance Florence, but they weren't capitalists. Also, capitalism isn't just the accumulation of wealth, or more specifically of surplus. Accumulation took place in Middle Kingdom Egypt, classical Athens, and Valois France, societies in which any surplus that existed was appropriated by ruling classes for their luxury or their military power. Capitalism is also not just private property, and that consideration takes us to the heart both of what capitalism is and why it's fundamentally flawed. Throughout history, property relations have entailed producers and appropriators, in other words, classes. Those who make goods and services and those who control the production and distribution of those goods and services, either by owning the means of production or by enlisting overt forms of coercion. Under the property or class relations of pre-capitalist economies, masters or overlords use superior political and military power to force producers to surrender some part of their surplus labor and production. And the differences in these forms of coercion mark the differences in economies. In chattel slavery, masters owned and forced slaves to work. In feudalism, nobles coerced serfs to perform labor on some part of the manor and surrender a portion of their own production. Under capitalist property relations, the dominant form of appropriation is based on legally free producers who are completely dispossessed from the means of production. Slaves were owned. Serfs and peasants had direct access to their own means of production. They could walk out the door and start working anytime they wanted, just so long as the lord got his due. In capitalism, owners and/or their managerial stewards determine access to the means of production. Even if they wanted to, workers can't just stroll into the factory or the office. Unlike chattel slaves or serfs, producers under capitalism are legally free, and their surplus labor in production is appropriated by the capitalist owner by purely economic means. That is, there's no overt compulsion in the relationship between producer and appropriator. Because direct producers are propertyless, their only access to the means of production, even to the means of their own labor, is the sale of their capacity to labor to owners in exchange for a wage. The worker has something to sell as dearly as possible, namely his or her capacity to labor, which the capitalist wants to purchase as cheaply as possible, so as to have the maximum left over for investment. Now, this unique relation, and it is historically unique, between propertyless producers and propertied appropriators is mediated by the market. Capitalism has certain laws of motion that distinguishes it from other forms of economic life. The imperatives of competition and profit maximization, a necessity to reinvest surpluses in production, and a systematic requirement to improve labor productivity and to develop technology. These laws of motion are enforced by the market, which serves a distinctive and historically unprecedented function in capitalism. It mediates access not only to goods, but to the very means of production themselves. Almost everything in capitalism is produced for the market. Both capitalists and laborers are utterly dependent on the market for the most basic conditions of life. Workers depend on the market to sell their capacity to labor as a commodity. Capitalists depend on the market to buy this capacity to labor, to purchase means of production, and to realize profits by selling goods or services produced by workers. Thus, capitalism is an inherently unstable, dynamic, and conflictual system. And thus, to echo Marx, class struggle is endemic to it. It is rooted in the very nature and logic of capitalist property. It isn't just some big misunderstanding or the product of envy and resentment on the part of workers. Just ask Warren Buffett, who once breezily informed the New York Times that, quote, "Of course there's a class struggle, and my side is winning." I want to underline two aspects of capitalism here: the coercive nature of its property relations and the competitive character of the social life that it generates. The mythology of capitalism abounds in the vocabulary of freedom. We speak of the free market, the creation of opportunity, the proliferation of choices, the opening of countries to trade, which often is produced by gun barrels, I might add. Yet we also speak of market forces. And forces, let me remind everyone here, are about compulsion. What I think needs to be clarified is that the distinctive and dominant characteristic of the capitalist market is not opportunity or choice, but on the contrary, compulsion. Despite the appearance of freedom and equality in the wage bargain, for instance, the worker is free to choose or reject the terms of employment offered by the owner. The owner's complete control of access to and use of the means of production puts him or her at a decisive advantage. Under slavery, your master chose you. Under capitalism, you choose your master. By the same token, the capitalist imperatives of competition, accumulation, and profit maximization mandate that owners acquire and seek to enlarge their control, not only over the means of production, but over workers themselves. No matter how affable or cultivated they are, they must resist or break unions. They must utilize technologies that render workers either obsolete, cheaper, and more pliable. They must oppose any effort on the part of the state to regulate the conditions under which they extract as much surplus as they can out of workers, regardless of how inhumane, socially irresponsible, or ecologically destructive those activities are. It's a matter of historical record that the only justice and equity that workers have ever achieved in capitalist nations have been acquired painfully and often in the face of great violence through unions, left-wing parties, and a generous welfare state. They have not been granted by pious, tender-hearted capitalists, which is why, contrary to some in the business school, socially irresponsible capitalism is pure ideological twaddle. It's essential to point out that capitalism did not appear in history as the free decision of uncoerced men and women. The history of capitalism is a long and ongoing tale of dispossession and violence, beginning with the confiscation and sale of monasteries in the 16th century, the Enclosure of Commons, meaning the eviction of serfs and peasants from land, from the 16th to the 18th centuries, the imperialist invasion and forcible transformation of numerous societies, beginning with Ireland in the 16th century. The creation of American capitalism required the removal and destruction of Native American tribes. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the trade in African slaves provided considerable startup capital for North Atlantic manufacturing, and plantation labor serviced the commodity markets in London and Amsterdam. And that's not to mention the bitter and often bloody struggles of workers to unionize in the 1870s, the 1890s, and the 1930s. One of the reasons your generation faces such a bleak and precarious economic future is the demolition of much of what was achieved in the 20th century by both of our political parties. Capitalism also forces human affairs into a competitive mold. As I've said, class, which means class conflict, is an indelible element of the capitalist property system. It's not a bug, it's a feature. That's why capitalism's most basic flaw is its promotion of an essentially martial conception of human affairs. Think of it as a just war theory of economics, in which men and women become soldiers of fortune, steeled against casualties and collateral damage. Now, apologists for capitalism will, of course, maintain that competition enforces the discipline that compels firms and individuals into efficiency and innovation. But let's remember that efficiency under capitalism is about the cost of production, and competitive pressure forces employers to exercise more control over workers, either through technology or managerial technique, or to shed them altogether. So while innovation at the point of production is about gaining more control over workers, and there's a rich historical literature about mechanization and automation that demonstrates this, at the point of marketing, it's about the creation of wants and needs that turns social life into a battleground of consumption and emulation. And yes, that too is the subject of an equally voluminous historical literature. Either way, human beings end up treating others as, at best, as strangers, and at worst, as enemy combatants in the market of all against all. Now, I think if you believe that we should act and treat others as though we were the image and likeness of God, it seems to me that friendship rather than competition should be our model of economic life. And friendship, given political form, is democracy, or collective deliberation over our common life. Socialism, I would contend, is the extension of democracy into economic life. A broad conversation about how we should reshape property relations in a way that allows us to flourish. Property is, after all, first and foremost about our relations with each other, not with things. So the renaissance of socialism in our current political culture, I think, is hopeful and encouraging because it gives us an opportunity that we have not taken for quite a while to ask some fundamental questions about what those relations among ourselves should look like. Now, I certainly don't deny that socialism has had, to say the least, a rocky historical career. But I still think that the old socialist ideal is worth our allegiance and our energy. That is, ownership and control of the means of production by workers themselves, and not, I should add, in the end, by the state. Socialism would enable workers not only to make their lives more secure, but also to put control over their own talents into their own hands, not those of owners and bosses. It would, in other words, enable us to reclaim our God-given creative powers and make us valiant producers of wealth rather than servile drones of filth. Thanks.
So thanks, Dr. Hirschfeld, Dr. McCarraher. Time for a brief question posed to each other. So Dr. McCarraher maybe has pride of place here since Dr. Hirschfeld's first.
Wow, I mean, I actually have so many, but here's one. Near the end of your talk, you allude to the fact, and you seem to allude to this rather sadly, actually, that markets must employ money, right? And it seems to me that this is part of the crux of the problem, right? Because you say also earlier that prices serve as signals about what the community needs. Well, the problem here, right, is, it seems to me, that money is not democratic, right? Those who have more money are therefore able to have more power to control the signals. And would it not therefore be the case that it is inevitable that those who have more money will control everything, since you are using money as, you know, your signaling device? So I guess that's one question. And I guess this is a twofold question. So would you therefore be in favor of, say, either dramatically raising taxes and redistributing money so that there would be greater egalitarianism? Would you take certain goods off the market and decommodify certain goods and services so that they would not be dependent on money? Or, and here's I'll go full bore utopian here. How about getting rid of money?
So when I was talking about the way that markets can serve a good economy, I was in this utopian world where we've gotten rid of our pleonexia desires, and I didn't have a chance to fully spell out what the economic life would look like in that world. But a key component of it that I stress usually when I give my long talks about this subject is if you're in right relationship with wealth, you know how much you need in order to lead a decent life. And anything you get above that is superfluous to you, and you would give it over to others. In such a world, you're just not going to have the same kinds of concentrations of wealth that we have. So your question about the undemocratic nature of money is the undemocratic nature of money in a market society that is shaped by pleonexia, right? So when I say that money and markets still have a role even in a good economy, that's what I mean. So those problems would in principle not come up. The fear is just the language of money would tempt us back into the world of pleonexia. And I think that's a life concern. So I don't think we get to utopia this side of the eschaton either. What I do want, though, is I think it's important to be able to articulate what a good economic order would look like, just so we can better articulate what's wrong with the one we have and find places to push back on it. Do we want to get rid of money altogether? This is going to come up in my question with you a little bit. If we go back to a world of barter, you're going to have a poorer economy probably. So.
Can I respond to that? Anthropologists and historians are pretty clear that barter was never a very extensive way to exchange goods. So I always wonder where economists get this idea that barter was ever very important. I guess my response is to ask you then. So, agreed, we're not in a world where pleonexia is either non-existent or it's so we're living in this world.
Yeah.
And so, would you advocate therefore taxing the wealthy at say 90% rates and redistributing the wealth so that we could have, a more egalitarian market? Where goods and services would be more equitably.
Yeah. No, if your question is what policy mix do I advocate given our fallen world that's all of a mess, if you wanted to argue for a higher tax on wealth, largely as a signal, as sort of a training wheels for the culture that nobody should think that happiness involves having a lot of it, I don't have a problem with that. I don't mind a certain amount of redistribution. Officially on all these issues, I maintain a policy of saying I want to be agnostic about the appropriate mix of markets and states and how much redistribution or whatever, because I think those are technical. There's pros and cons on all of them. There's a complicated secular literature on that, and I'm willing to let it go. But yeah, no, we have too much inequality. I just don't think you're going to solve that problem just through institutions without also changing hearts and minds about what the economy is for. I do.
Okay.
Okay. So, because when I look at our economy, I guess I worry about the language of the capitalism as a system that has all these necessary inexorable trends that must always and everywhere be part of it. I certainly see plenty of that behavior out there that you're calling out, right? When I teach my students about capitalism, I always say, you have to see the dark side. There's a really large dark side. But if we're just looking at our economy without putting labels on it, that's not all that I see. I also see a whole lot of people voting with their feet to come into the country because they have dreams of starting a business as a dry cleaner, as one of our former students' parents did, creating shops, small shops and small businesses where they can make their own living and make their own way. And my question for you is, what room does your vision have for smaller scale capitalism? Is it okay for me to open a dry cleaning store and hire a few guys?
As long as they end up owning the place. No, I mean that's my serious answer. One of the fundamental problems, it seems to me, with capitalism is these power relations. Small business, I think, is given way too romantic a view in American business mythology. Small businesses could be just as exploitative, just as awful, especially to women and children. Historically, it seems to me that this is definitely the case. And I'd even have to say that the emergence of a corporate form of capitalism in many ways was great for women, because it actually gave them opportunities to organize, to maintain, to acquire state power, and so on. So actually, yeah, I'm all for small-scale capitalism as long as the workers own everything. And I also don't think, and I also think that there's a certain way in which we, especially in the United States, seem to believe that workers are not capable of running their own enterprises. I mean, we seem to think that workers, and I think this is an especially professional managerial class prejudice, that ordinary people simply cannot run their lives. They can. We just don't give them the choice. And why? Because that would mean that our profits would fall and our ownership would be violated. So
I guess my response, and it's just a response, would be, I think there is a dark side to all of this, but there's also a light side, and I think you systematically don't see the goods that are there. So
I'm just talking about historically existing capitalism. So I can only judge by what I've seen and what I've read. And it seems to me that if this is what we're getting, then this has to be the nature of the system, if this is what we're getting.
Okay. So student questions. There's one here.
Thank you both for speaking. I'm a sophomore economics major, so unfortunately.
About the alchemy and witchcraft part, perhaps?
So Dr. I just have a few questions about what you said. One is that I think this idea that economics and capitalism is just this gloom and doom picture where everyone dies and suffers is just outrageous. I think that if you look at
When did I say that?
I think that if you look at history, it's very evident that the nations that have prospered have been capitalist, or at least free market to a certain extent. The nations that have suffered have been socialist and communist. I mean, if people would rather live in Venezuela, they have the freedom to do so, but people aren't doing that in droves right now, so I just don't see it. My question is just if you think that respectfully, if you think that socialism is the better form of government, then why do you trust the government to make decisions rather than the individual operating a free society?
Thanks. First of all, I never said that I trust government to tell individuals what to do. I mean, I think a lot of this is a kind of prefabricated sort of argument that's often given to socialists. You guys think that government should make decisions about everything. Let me just say that I'm talking about democracy. Democracy is not necessarily a state. This is why I advocate worker ownership of factories and offices. I'm not advocating state ownership at all. In fact, I would agree with Dr. Hirschfeld that state-centered models of socialism have been horrific. You're not going to get an argument from me about that. As far as the fact that capitalist nations have been wealthier and more productive, I still refer you to the distinction I made between wealth and filth. I think that a lot of what's produced in capitalist nations is not genuine wealth. And I think Dr. Hirschfeld would agree with me. If we're going to judge the health of an economy simply by the amount that's produced, then you should be okay with the production of as many cigarettes as possible. You should be okay with the production of as much disgusting processed meat as is possible. There's a whole lot of products which are judged as wealth, which are genuine filth. And it seems to me that conventional economics is incapable of making these kinds of decisions because it is simply quantitative in the way that it evaluates wealth. Yeah.
I do think GDP is a bad measure of wealth because a lot of it is channeled towards bad ends. That said, I think we Americans tend to radically underestimate how well off we are as a result of markets unfolding over the last several centuries. Our standard of living is 5 times higher than it was 100 years ago, and they were already the richest people ever. My friend Dr. Anna Moreland is traveling in Ghana, and she texted me or emailed me about the unbelievable poverty she saw there, but that used to be the standard for the human condition. So there's something to be said about markets for generating a world where we don't have to worry about having enough to eat, where we get to live lifespans that are double what they were as recently as 120 years ago. The standard of living in America in the 1800s was roughly comparable to what you see in the continent of Africa today.
I mean, I would also want to remind you that a lot of the more equitable distribution of wealth in the United States and other Western nations has been achieved by struggle. People had to fight for this. We'll call it labor unions, which were often quashed violently by capitalists themselves. So I think we need to remember a lot of history here, that these advances in the standard of living have been fought for politically. They weren't handed to you.
Questions on this? Go ahead.
Hi, Hi, my name's Dale. Been out of Villanova for 2 years. Do you think there'll be an opportunity for union power to restabilize after some period of expansive growth, such as we're having right now?
Well, certainly not under the current administration. And frankly, the Democratic Party hasn't been very good on this either. You know, that's why I emphasized in my remarks that the destruction of much of the welfare advances in welfare over the 20th century were destroyed by both parties, not just the Republicans. The neoliberal Democrats from Clinton to Obama have been awful on this score. Obama was given a chance, in fact, in his first term, to support laws that would have made it much easier for workers to organize, and he squashed it. Why? Because he's basically a friend of Wall Street, and always was. So I think certainly under the current kind of political culture that we have, a revitalization of unions is going to be very difficult. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I'm encouraged by the popularity of Sanders, because I think that you would have much greater opportunities for workers to organize. And I'm not quite sure it's in his platform, but he would be in favor of, I think, repealing the Taft-Hartley Act, which is one of the worst forms of labor legislation ever passed. So that's a way of saying I'm hopeful but not optimistic.
Good evening to you both. My name is Joe, and I'm actually visiting from Virginia Tech. I'm a political science major. So my question is for Dr. McCarraher, excuse me if I get your name wrong. So I have a great many questions for you. However, I'll tailor it to one specific point, and that's on unions. So you talk about how unions. So you talk about how workers should own the means of their production, but you say through unions. However, unions create a power structure or a class structure. So, and if that is created, then that just continue that out, then you have government coming from that, in a sense. So then no longer do the workers actually own their own means of production, but they own it by means of the union. So in the system that you're trying to create, it would seem to me the best way to remove the unions and management and government from that. However, how do you do that practically? Thank you.
Well, listen, I mean, if you look at the history of unions, I'm certainly not going to defend, the Teamsters, for God's sake. I think that one of the reasons that the labor movement was in fact decimated in the 1970s and 80s is precisely because they went along too much with management. They were not conflictual enough. their own members often wanted their leaders to be more forthright in struggling for their interests. So look, I mean, I think unions themselves should be more democratic than they are. I'll grant that. And I guess I don't quite understand the question you're asking about government. Could you rephrase that, or?
So it seems to me that whenever you have a society, there's leadership, and out of leadership comes a sort of government. Maybe not the government, say, as we have today, but there is some leadership and control of other people underneath you. So, and that's the case with unions. Union members pay dues to a union organization, and they control their messaging and their political outreach and all that aspect. You're trying to make a system that has no hierarchy.
That would be ideal.
But your means of creating that creates in itself a hierarchy.
Okay, I think maybe this is partly like the question or the assertion that Dr. Hirschfeld made, with which I agree, that you're never going to eliminate sin from human relations. Okay, that's a given. But I do think that you can create structures that at least militate as much as they can against the formation of these kinds of invidious hierarchies, right? I always, in fact, we said this at dinner before, that there's the Catholic worker, Peter Moran, would often say that what he wants is a world in which it is easier for people to be good. I like the way that's formed, because it's not saying I want a world in which people are angels. I don't want a world in which people are perfect. I want a world in which it is easier for people to be good. And I agree with Dr. Hirschfeld that transformations of desire are absolutely crucial here, but it's also, it seems to me, the case, you have to create structures that also reflect those values and can reinforce them. So in some ways, I'm sympathetic to what you're suggesting.
Hi, my name is Jose. I'm just a friend of Villanova's, actually, not an alum here. A question for Dr. Hirschfeld. You say that you're agnostic about, to what degree there's, what the mix should look like. The church tells us, right, that there's a right to food, a right to water, a right to healthcare, a right to housing. These basic needs, right, they all have to be met. My question is, isn't getting the mix precisely, precisely the point? Isn't it, for example, the question we have before us with, Bernie Sanders, with all his shortcomings, the fact that he says, we need to have universal health care, isn't that, standing on the right side of that question, for example, precisely the point?
Yeah, now this is where I actually get a little bit animated. If I could stand up, I'd be hopping up and down right now. So we should all absolutely care about those goals. The debates are about what's the best way to achieve those goals, and that's why I'm officially agnostic. There's a presumption that a policy that on the surface looks like it's there to address them, like say, let's have universal health care, is the way to give better health care to everybody. And maybe on that kind of a question, that's right, but not on all of them. Just to cherry pick low-hanging fruit, I want there to be good housing for everybody. But I don't necessarily want there to be rent controls, because rent controls are counterproductive. They tend to shrink the housing supply and end up giving the scarce housing supply usually to people who don't need the help. It tends hurting to more than it helps. So I would really like us to all agree that what matters are the goals, and then to have a free and easy back and forth to understand when are the places where some kind of state intervention or some kind of state program is the place to help, and when are the places where markets actually do a better job. And my experience as an economist says that that's a complicated question, and anybody who tells you that the right answer is always and everywhere to do the state, or always and everywhere to let the market go, they're just not seriously engaging the complexity of the issue.
Going back to the example of healthcare, that would be an example as an advocate of some kind of Medicare for. Actually, it should be Medicaid for all. I think if you actually look at Medicare and Medicaid. it's an example of decommodifying something, taking it off the market, so it is not dependent on money. And I'll just admit, I mean, this should be, I think, a goal, to decommodify as much as we can of all social and economic life, so that it's not dependent on money. Now, can we do this? Probably not this side of paradise, but I think that should be our goal.
When you say it matters how you go about this, the fact to me that the church says this is a right, it's telling the government, you must find a way to make this.
No.
That's a right. I mean, it must be the case.
Well, no, because the government can decide that the best way to get these needs met is through the market. So, for example, you have absolutely the right to food. Does it bother you that the government is not providing you food? No. Well, of course they will, but the point is that the market does a pretty good job of providing food to most people. And so it's one way of provisioning. And then the government can be there to play backstop, and the debate is how to balance those things.
Hi, my name is Allison Baroni. I'm a sophomore here at Villanova. Thanks so much. This has been fascinating. I enjoyed listening to both of you. My question's for Dr. Hirschfeld. So you had mentioned in one of the responses Ghana and the standard of living there, and compared it to the standard of living in capitalist societies. But the standard of living, particularly in Western Africa, and the level of starvation that we see as a result of drought didn't happen until after Western Europe went in and colonized those countries and changed the farming production to a capitalist system, and then extracted resource and labor and sold it back to these other countries, creating dependencies. So how do we reconcile that outgrowth of capitalism and look at the way that capitalism has impacted different societies and made inequalities and development across the globe?
I am not here to argue that capitalism has never harmed people or created poverty or pockets of despair. I am sure that it has in many places. The point I wanted to make is that people who emphasize that tend to underestimate the fact that that used to be the common condition for everybody prior to capitalism without the exploitation. My area of somewhat expertise was on economic history, primarily of Europe. If you go back to the Middle Ages and look at the standard of living back then, it would be people living in huts that had no windows, that had no chimney really for their fires, where there's one bed for the family. It's the world where the rats could carry in the plague and carry off a third of the population because everybody's literally at the margin, where the famine fails, where the harvest fails every 7 years and there's serious hunger. And the average lifespan would be 30 or 40 years. And that's true really up until just a couple hundred years ago. We need to bear in mind that there has been a miracle through the spread of markets that has lifted lots and lots of us out of poverty. And I agree we had to fight for, there's been a lot of struggle about how widely that should be shared. But the scope of what has happened, I don't think happens without that kind of market.
Hi, my name is Quinn. Thank you, Dr. McCarraher. Thank you, Dr. Hirschfeld. This question is for both of you. Do you think, is it possible to have a kind of, say, a scale to measure how much good or how much resources that an individual or a society can have? Another way, is there a cap? Can there be a cap to capitalism? Because, for example, America isn't always this wealthy, but American quality of life seems to be degrading over time as American wealth grow.
Yeah, That's really the heart of a lot of the stuff that I'm trying to do, is to say to people, you need to figure out what actually constitutes a good standard of living, and figure that out first, and then figure out how much money you need in order to make that living happen. There is a phenomenon whereby once you've ratcheted up to a certain standard of living, it's really hard to ratchet back down. Once we have air conditioners, we find it very hard to go back to the world that everybody used to live in not that long ago, where there was no air conditioning. So my practical approach to that is say, at least we can stop, right? Because we're well beyond what we need at this point, clearly. And just try to get out of the habit of thinking just one more 10% raise. And when I put it that way, I mean to indict almost everybody in this room. Everybody thinks that they could do better off by having a little bit more. And I would rather have people notice just how much you already have and figure out how to make a good life out of that. If we could just stop the process, then we could start maybe coming back to something that's more reasonable. I think our excessive affluence really takes us out of touch with a lot of what's important in life, and I think it's damaging.
Another way to answer your question would be, you're going to be forced to think about these caps, literally forced by economic and ecological conditions. I think I argue in my book that one of the stories of the 21st century is going to be the decline of American empire. You are in fact in the initial stages of this, and your children and your grandchildren are going to have to deal with this as well. So actually, I don't think this is gloom and doom. I actually think that the decline of American imperial power, and even to some extent the decline of what we call the American way of life, is going to force us to ask questions about the quality of that life. And we should actually see it possibly as a moment of opportunity, and even as a sense, we greet it with a sense of jubilation, frankly, that we no longer think that the world has to be superintended by American violence for the purposes of American expansion. So I think your generation should welcome it.
Hi, I'm Thomas. I'm a junior here at Villanova. This is specifically for Dr. Hirschfeld. And I'm not taking notes, so I'm sorry if I misremembered or I'm misrepresenting your position. But I was curious about, you said earlier that at the advent of capitalism, the way that workers were conditioned to kind of be more more amenable or more ready to to accumulate, to kind of you kind of acknowledged a change in their social character at the advent of capitalism. But then later, when you're defending the need for the market, you talk about that there's kind of this innate rapacious or greed that you think the market can channel into a good effect. So I guess my question is, how can you reconcile that change? Or
You did, well, maybe I wasn't clear.
Okay.
The argument that capitalism is good because it channels all this rapacious greed into good ends, that's the standard one that's given for the market. It's conceding pleonexia and saying, given pleonexia, what's the best we can do? That's the story they tell. I'm going to call out and say part of the problem with that is it inculcates in people this false sense that they need more and more, which they had to actually instill in people. So I don't know if that clarified or not, but I don't think it's good that people feel like they have to have always a 10% more.
Okay.
Member Phil Donahue, is anybody? Member Phil Donahue?
Hello, my name is Liam. I'm a freshman here at Villanova. I have a question for Dr. McCarraher, who should have recognized me from class earlier today. Today, in fact, we were discussing the pre-Marxian utopian socialists, and towards the end of class, we brought up John Stuart Mill, who became something of a utopian socialist himself towards the end of his life, and how he sort of described the steady-state economy by which there would be this diminishing economic output as well as gross inequality. Do you believe that John Stuart Mill would see the current economic conditions and state that we live in and describe that as the time in which we should begin to pursue these utopian socialist ideals, and as he would describe, I believe it was, desirable, necessary, and inevitable?
Well, Let me just, emphasize, I'm not utopian, right? I mean, I really think that needs to be stressed. One of the standard charges about socialists is that you guys want to bring, heaven down to earth. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, at least I don't think so. As far as interpreting Mill, Mill did become what's called a steady state socialist, in which he believed that capitalism would inevitably reach a limit beyond which it could not grow. I don't know. Sometimes I think that the tales of like Mark Twain's death are premature. The end of capitalism, or the steady state of capitalism, has been announced several times over the last 100 years. So I don't want to add to that that wrong-headed chorus. So that's kind of a way of not answering your question. I don't know if capitalism is going to stop growing, because it seems to be ingenious at commodifying things and therefore finding ways to grow. We can now commodify things through virtual technology. We can, so I'm not sure. Do you think we're reaching a steady state?
I mean, if you measure by GDP, no, I don't think we're, but I actually take seriously your distinction between wealth and ill, in which case we actually long since have reached, you see what I'm saying? So.
Hi, I'm Gina. I'm a senior in the Villanova School of Business, and I'm also a humanities minor. And my question is sort of like, the nature of this debate is between two people who sort of aren't like, say, a pure atheistic capitalist, a pure atheistic socialist, but rather two people with a background in faith. And so part of my question is, to what extent can both of these works sort of reach beyond sort of the confines of having a Catholic background and sort of starting a conversation beyond that, and to what extent it's a totally foreign concept to talk about something of just of this not being a pure wealth, or the concepts of illth and those things actually making an impact, especially within an American context of just this being totally foreign with a very deistic framework even within our own Constitution.
Yeah, we both have to grapple with this one way or the other. The way I think about my project, the way I try to sell it to secular audiences, and I do get to speak to them a lot, is to point out the fact that people actually do feel an emptiness in their pursuit of more, that there really is a hunger for this. We all know that we're anxious and stressed out and leading kind of lost lives. And I use that as a wedge to open up this idea that maybe our happiness is found in perfection and fullness rather than in expansion and extension. And I actually think I have some purchase. Like, I don't think it's going to, I just feel like as long as we keep talking and tap into that's how you get a chance to change the culture. I'm not fooling myself that it's going to change tomorrow. So.
I guess I have a two-part answer to this. One is that my book has been received well in secular venues. In fact, it was given a pretty good review in The Humanist, of all places, which was kind of shocking to me. And I learned a couple of days ago that it's going to get a good review in Jacobin, which is, like the, now the flagship journal of the left, I suppose. So I wouldn't assume at all that secular people on the left are not receptive to this kind of message. The other thing I'll say is that I think sometimes you will find support in places you least expect it. One thing that always fascinates me about American religious culture is New Age. Now, I know it's loopy, and I know all the jokes about Marianne Williamson, and all of this kind of stuff. But I actually think Marianne Williamson was a really, really, really interesting person. I thought that she had some of the most profound things to say during those debates, and yet she was dismissed as loopy. I just think that you should. You got to work with what you're given. You can't start from where you want to be. You start from where you are. And so if you can engage with people on the secular left or right, if you can engage with people who you think are loopy because they believe in crystals or whatever, that's what you have to do. You know, I think it's possible to create a kind of language with which you can engage people. So I certainly wouldn't want what Mary and I do to be hermetically sealed off, you know, from these audiences. So.
Thank you for your lecture, or debate. My question is for Dr. Hirschfeld, and it's sort of twofold. I haven't read your book, and it might address this, but the first part of my question is if you have a vision for Catholics in the working world, and if it's more small-scale, kind of oriented, Benedict option kind of thing, or if it's more ambitious. And then secondly, are you worried about capitalism in a way maybe you weren't 15 years ago, since it seems large businesses, as Dr. McCarraher earlier pointed out when we were talking this afternoon, calling them, are run by woke plutocrats, in which it's profitable for businesses to hold liberal social views in a way it maybe wasn't before. And so large scale, that's an issue because people can be coerced into either not speaking or coerced into actually not holding a position about something because their fear of getting fired or what have you. That's big picture. And then small picture, it's like family life can be disrupted because, or community life can be disrupted because your businesses are encouraging you to prioritize work above all things, right? So you have the individual problem, then you have the cultural problem. And it seems that businesses are actually encouraging a sort of a set of opinions that they might not have been. So are you worried about that? And then the first part, so it's sort of what's your vision?
Yeah. So when I'm talking specifically to Catholics or Christians, what should the individual person do? This is what I'm kind of talking to all my students about all the time. And the answer is just, first of all, to notice how much they've been pulled away from their own faith, the sacramental view of the world, by this picture that's shaped by pleonexia and happiness is down the road of more rather than through this other thing. So just trying to create space for people to see what a good life, what the shape of a good life looks like. Then in terms of practical matters, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. It's figuring out what works for you. Maybe you're called to go work in a big corporation and just try to do it in a more humane way whenever possible. Maybe it's to start your own business. I mean, there's just a million different ways this goes. We're strangers in a strange land, right? We're aliens. We're supposed to be aliens, and that means we have to pick our spots or pick our way through it carefully. But I think I just want to set out that there's a vision of what you're aiming to, and then, but I don't have we should all go and retreat into a Benedict option or anything like that. I think we're called to try to live out our faith as best we can where we're planted. How do I feel about capitalism after the last over the development? The advantage of being older is you got to actually see the culture shift. I'm fairly horrified. I'm getting more and more radical, and not left-right radical, but anti-establishment radical, because the concentration of power, however you construe it, is just really terrifying me. And I don't know what to say about that. Somewhere in the 80s or 90s, something broke, it feels to me, where it became okay. Like the pursuit, the students used to think a good life was being a doctor or a lawyer, and now they think it's making a killing on Wall Street, and something really terrible has happened in a culture that's gotten reconfigured in that way.
We're coming to the end of our time, and since I'm the moderator, I get to ask the last question. These are very good books, very different kinds of books. Mary's book strikes me as sort of a love song to economics in some ways. She's trying to rescue the discipline to make it more of what it should be. Jean is telling a different story about the history of the United States, basically. But at the heart of both of these different books is a sacramental realism. And this was what struck me after I finished Jean's book, how similar the sensibilities were. Different ideas, different purposes to the book, but there is a real sort of invitation to readers to reorient ourselves to the way the world actually is. and a sense that that our problem is actually occlusion, that we've gotten away from a sense of the way the world is. So that the problem is kind of unreality. And then you each in different ways propose a kind of a sacramental realism and a kind of a dilation of the imagination for what's possible. And that's really the kind of reorientation that you're asking us to engage. Didn't come up in the Q&A or in the comments, but I wonder if you would just say a little bit each briefly, because we're almost out of time, about what that sacramental vision looks like and how it impacted your work.
As I work through this project, it's been like 10 years in the making. I have myself been converted to the way of like getting past seeing things in terms of dollars and cents and abstractions and towards seeing what's really at stake in human lives and our economic activities with one another. And the more I turn into that to what you call the real, as when you look at the good of an apple, this is an example I always use, the good of the apple reflects something of goodness of God, and if you can see it in that light, you can more fully appreciate the goodness of the apple itself. And if we could all turn back to that real goodness, the pleonexia problem would go away, because you would find actual satiation in that. If you could be present to the goods in your life, you would actually realize how blessed and abundant things are, and it would point you to what your heart is really longing for, which is God. So it's the heart of the book. Yeah.
One of the epigrams to my book is Gerard Manley Hopkins' God's Grandeur, where he says that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. That I take as a definitive sacramental principle. And the heroes of my book are not the Marxists, they're the Romantics, the capital R Romantics. And I see the Romantics as in many ways the modern heirs to the sacramental imagination. And so I think, but there's another line in the Hopkins poem about how everything is bleared, smeared with toil. And that, I think, becomes the basis of the kind of romantic anti-capitalism. So I mean, I do want to politicize Hopkins. I mean, that's really what I'm doing, unashamedly. And but I also want to quote one of our favorite authors, John Ruskin, once again. The desire of the heart is the light of the eyes. And I think that once one sees this, has this sacramental realism and is open to the sacramental imagination, your desires will change because you're seeing the world as it is. I mean, I agree with you. I think one of the problems here is unreality. We are walking around in a bad dream world. And that should be the basis of a new politics.